One of the most common questions I get about knitting is why I bother doing it in the first place. And if you're not a knitter and you don't know a knitter, that can seem like a reasonable question. You can buy pretty much everything you need in the stores without investing much time and without spending as much money as you would spend on a lot of knitting projects. But there are so many reasons outside of that financial incentive for why knitters still engage in this centuries-old craft. Welcome back to The Apiary, a knitting podcast. My name is Lauren Rad. I design knitting patterns, especially accessories, with a special focus on socks. And I can tell you, my sock designing has triggered a whole bunch of curious questions from people because I can buy a pack of socks at the store for like $5 for a multi-pack. So why am I spending $30 on yarn, plus however much on needles, and then investing 15, 20, sometimes even more hours of my time into knitting something that's going to go on my feet? In today's episode, we're going to be looking at some of the many reasons that knitters continue knitting, even though it doesn't make a lot of sense to people from the outside. Now, the thing is, for decades now, the kind of general consensus has been that knitting is a dying art and nobody knits anymore. But that's not actually true. It's certainly less common than when people needed to knit for basic survival, where you couldn't just go to the store and buy socks, and you couldn't just go to the store and buy mittens, and you couldn't just go to the store and buy sweaters, and you needed those to keep your family warm and safe through the winter. That's certainly true. But even though knitting is no longer a necessity in that same way, there are still millions of us around the world who are knitting regularly. And there is a huge variety of different kinds of knitters. We come in all ages, shapes, sizes, genders, nationalities, you name it. Whatever level of diversity there can be in a community, there are knitters who fit that description. Knitters are also unique from each other in lots of other ways, from the types of projects that draw us, whether you love socks or whether you love shawls, whether you love knitting garments, to the types of color palettes that we find appealing. Some of us really love knitting with soft neutrals, others love really bright and funky yarns. Some knitters love a real variety in their knitting projects, and so maybe they might knit a soft, muted pair of socks and then a loud and funky sweater. And other knitters are really committed to a specific range of projects that they like to work on, and so they will only knit using certain colors, or they will only knit with certain fibers, or they will only knit certain types of projects. Once you realize how many knitters there are and how many different kinds of knitters there are, it makes sense when you think about why knitters knit to realize that there are that many different reasons for why we knit as well. But out of curiosity, I wanted to see what some of the more common reasons were for knitting. So I pulled my friends over on Instagram and I asked them, why is it that you knit? What is it that draws you to this art form? I've pulled together 8 of the most common responses that I got from people, which match some of my own motivations for knitting too. And remember, the same knitter can have multiple motivations for knitting. I know I do. So let's look at each of those reasons in turn. And the most common reason I got when knitters told me why they like to knit is that it helps them relax. Now, if you've been around a knitter who's made a mistake or dropped a stitch or is working on a complicated pattern, you might be surprised by that answer because I'm not sure I do more swearing in any other area of my life than while I am knitting, unless I'm stuck in traffic in a big city. And yet, knitting is still relaxing, even for those of us who get a little bit annoyed and frustrated with it sometimes. For the most part, it can be a really soothing activity, and that can feel so nice at the end of a long, busy day. Many knitters enter a flow state while they're working, which is a state where you are so focused on something that you are enjoying that you don't notice the passage of time anymore. You are just locked in and focused on that thing you're doing, and that can be a really comforting, pleasurable experience. Having that relaxation from your knitting can be especially helpful when you are in a particularly busy period of life, and then there's an unexpected roadblock that you cannot get around. So things like you have a doctor's appointment and the doctor's running late, and it's probably not their fault. It's probably not anybody's fault. There may have just been something that happened that they couldn't avoid. But you're busy and it's stressful and you see the time ticking away and you're going, oh my gosh, I'm wasting all this time. Well, if you have your knitting with you, it's not really wasted time anymore. Now you can have a little relaxing time while you wait. Closely linked to the relaxation purpose for knitting that I heard from a lot of knitters was many knitters telling me that they knit for their mental health. And those are related, certainly, but they're not exactly the same thing. There is some research, though relatively small sample sizes, indicating that knitting can be helpful for people who are dealing with depression or anxiety, though I always think it's a good idea to check with a professional and use all of the available tools that you have in your mental health toolkit. But there are some people who find that when they are having a rough mental health patch, knitting can be really helpful for that. And I did hear that from several knitters who responded to my question. Similarly, I've heard from a lot of neurodivergent knitters who say that for them, knitting is kind of a socially acceptable form of either stimming or fidgeting. Another reason I heard commonly from knitters, and something that I feel myself as well, is the joy of learning a new skill. One of my favorite things about knitting is that no matter how long you've been doing it, whether it's 3 months or 3 years or 30 years or longer, there's always something new to learn. There are new techniques, new skills, new patterns coming out, new materials to try. There's always something new to learn. And with knitting, learning those new techniques is often a relatively easy process. So you get that joy, that rush of learning something new and feeling proud of yourself. That's something that as adults, we frequently don't have a lot of spaces in our lives to experience. We have workplaces where if we try new things and we screw it up, the consequences can be pretty significant. We have home lives that we need to manage, right? We have friendships where we're trying to just maintain the friendships when, life is already chaotic enough and we don't really want to make mistakes that could screw things up. Knitting, though, gives us a space where we can try new things, screw up, rip out our work, and try it again until it works. And the thing is, there are very few real consequences for our mistakes. The worst thing that's going to happen is that you spent a little time working on something that didn't work out, and maybe you've frogged your yarn a few too many times and now it's no longer usable and you have to use some other yarn. If you're a surgeon and you try something new and it doesn't work out, that can be a problem. If you're a knitter and you try something new and it doesn't work out, rip your work back and try again. Many knitters also told me that one of the reasons they love knitting is that it gives them a connection to their past, or even sometimes specifically to their ancestors. And that's another thing I think is really cool about knitting, is how many knitters learned their craft from a beloved family member. And that beloved family member may no longer be here with them, but they still have that connection to the family member through the craft that they learned from them. Even for those of us who didn't learn from a family member, there are still fond connections to the people who taught us our craft. I learned from a friend of mine in law school who learned from her grandmother. And so I feel like even though I didn't learn from my own grandmother, through the chain of learning from other people, I have connections to the people whose skills were passed down to me. For many people, knitting is not only connected to family history, it's also connected to cultural identity. And that's especially true in areas where there are heritage knitting techniques being practiced. Those heritage techniques might take the form of certain lace stitches arranged in a particular pattern, or color work worked in a certain number of colors at a certain time and over a certain dimension, or particular shapes for slippers or socks, or unique construction techniques for garments. Those techniques that get used in heritage knitting get passed down within a community. And so it becomes not just a family connection, but a cultural and community connection, a connection to place and time. And even on a very basic level, it's really neat knowing that whenever I pick up a pair of double-pointed needles and work on some socks, I am using the same method and the same tools that have been used by millions of knitters for hundreds and hundreds of years. Another response I heard pretty regularly is something that actually kind of is two separate responses that I have lumped into one category, and it's concerns about capitalism and fast fashion. One is the concern of how those factors affected the knitter, and the other is concern of how those factors affected the people working in the fast fashion industry and fast fashion's impact upon the environment. For that first subcategory of responses, there was an interesting thread of people saying, living in a capitalist society, there's a lot of pressure to be efficient and productive all the time, and that your value is almost judged on the basis of how efficient and productive you are and how much you contribute to the economy. If you're living in a society where the value of a person is judged in part or in majority on how much they contribute economically and how efficiently they do so, then knitting doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because it's inefficient, it's slow, it only produces so many things at once, it doesn't really scale that well, and people are generally not willing to pay for the amount of labor that goes into a hand-knit item. Knitters in this subcategory mentioned that it feels good to opt out of that pressure, to always be efficient and always be producing, and to say, I'm going to do something inefficient now just for me, just because I enjoy it. Now, the other subgroup in this category had similar concerns about how capitalism and fast fashion affect people, but they were thinking about a different group of people, which is how fast fashion affects the people who make their garments. There are an awful lot of news stories out there about how people working in the fast fashion industry are paid very low wages, work very long hours, work in very uncomfortable and sometimes even dangerous conditions. And so that is a reasonable concern that a lot of people have. There were also concerns about how fast fashion affects the environment, especially how disposable fast fashion is. And so for those knitters, making their own clothing was a way to opt out of what they view as an exploitative or environmentally harmful process. If you make the garment yourself and you source the materials yourself, so you know you're getting the materials from a good source, and you repair the material yourself, you can guarantee that the person making the products is treated well and that the item is not going to be thrown away quickly. Another common reason I heard from knitters was that they want unique or high quality clothing that they either can't get in stores or can't afford in stores. And again, this is kind of a two pieces of a response that are kind of put together into the same category. A lot of shoppers have noticed the steady decline in the quality of clothing over the last 20 to 30 years. Materials have gotten thinner, seams have gotten flimsier, garments have started skipping certain construction techniques that used to make them more comfortable or more durable. There are fewer linings inserted garments, and a lot of manufacturers are relying on stretch fabric to kind of gloss over fit issues or construction issues with the garments. Now, that might mean that if you want a really high quality garment, say a beautiful sweater knit from a wool silk linen blend with no synthetics in it, your best bet might be to just make it yourself. That's also the case if you want truly unique or unusual clothing that nobody around you has, or if the clothes you like are not currently in style. And that was a challenge that I had when I started knitting. I have always loved frilly, ornamented fabrics, lots of lace trim, pin tucks and ruffles. That was not in style in like 2010. And so for a while there, if I wanted those things, I had to make them myself. Even nowadays, when there has been this kind of resurgence in sort of neo-Edwardian fashion, and there are brands making clothing like that, it doesn't always fit into my budget, or maybe they don't cut in a shape that fits me well, or they're not using colors that suit me well, and so I still end up making things for myself instead. The seventh reason I frequently heard from knitters is that they just love handmade things. And I get that. There is something special about knowing that the thing you have has been made lovingly, slowly, tenderly by hand, with care and affection and attention put into it. While I do want to emphasize that all clothing is handmade to a certain extent, because there is no machine that completely manufactures a piece of clothing without human involvement, and there are human hands operating those sewing machines for any piece of clothing that you buy. There is a difference for some people in a hand knit sweater versus a machine knit sweater. I'll be honest, I'm an equal opportunity sweater lover. I'm currently wearing a machine knit sweater myself that I bought from a company. But even in those circumstances, there's something really special about wearing a sweater that I knit for myself with my own two hands. And the last response that I have frequently heard from knitters is that they need customized clothing to accommodate their body shape. This is something that is an unfortunate side effect of having standardized clothing blocks for ready-to-wear clothing. And it's not something we're ever going to be able to completely avoid so long as we are buying clothes off the rack and not buying completely customized clothes. For most of us, buying a completely bespoke wardrobe is simply not in the financial cards. And so being able to make some of those clothes ourselves and make them fit us just the way we need them to fit us is really helpful. For example, for me, I have very broad shoulders and a long torso relative to my other measurements. And so I rarely find blazers that fit me unless I can really size up on them. Or t-shirts are often just way too short on me because everyone's doing that slightly cropped thing, which on my torso is very cropped. So for me, being able to knit my own garments and adjust them for my measurements is super helpful. When I knit myself a t-shirt, I can make adjustments in the sleeves so that they don't go at a weird diagonal like this and they actually go down to sit parallel to the floor. And when I knit myself a sweater, I can knit it long enough in the torso that it covers as much of me as I want it to cover. So those are the most common reasons I heard from knitters for why they knit. But they're certainly not the only reasons out there. There are dozens and dozens of other reasons why knitters love to continue with this craft, this art, this hobby that has given so many people joy over the years. I'd love to hear from you about the reasons that you continue knitting, especially if they're reasons that I haven't covered yet in this video. Drop your comments down below and we can have a conversation about it. Otherwise, thanks for being here for another episode, and I'll see you next time. Happy stitching!